The Echoes of Ravenswood Manor. Part 1. Arrival at Ravenswood Manor. The carriage rolled along a bumpy road lined with tall, dark trees. The sun was setting, and shadows stretched across the ground. Ellie sat quietly, holding her suitcase on her lap. She didn't know much about the place she was going, but her heart felt heavy with nervous excitement. When the carriage stopped, Ellie stepped out and stared at the house in front of her. Ravenswood Manor was huge and old, with gray stone walls and windows that seemed almost too dark to see through. Thick vines grew up the sides of the building, and the air smelled like rain and wet leaves. Somewhere nearby, a bird made a sharp cry, startling her. Before Ellie could take it all in, the heavy front doors of the house opened with a loud creak. A tall man stepped out. He had sharp features, streaks of gray in his dark hair, and eyes that seemed to notice everything. "Eleanor," he said in a deep, calm voice. "Welcome." "Thank you," Ellie said softly. This man, her uncle Alaric, was a stranger to her. She had only seen his name on letters before today. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside. "We'll talk later. You'll need to settle in first." Ellie picked up her suitcase and followed him into the house. The front hall was huge, with a tall staircase that spiraled up to the next floor. A big chandelier hung from the ceiling, though its lights were dim. The wooden floor creaked under her feet, and the air was cool and smelled like old books and stone. "You'll find your room upstairs," Uncle Alaric said, pointing toward the staircase. "Second door on the right. Dinner is at 8. Do not wander." He turned and walked down a hallway, disappearing into the shadows. Ellie stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. The house was so quiet that even her breathing felt too loud. She slowly climbed the stairs, holding the railing tightly. The faces of old portraits hung on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. She looked away quickly. Something about this house felt strange. Not just old, but alive in some way. Ellie reached the second door on the right and opened it. Her room was small but tidy, with a bed, a desk, and a single window. The bed was covered with a thick blanket, and a candle flickered on the desk. She set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling both excited and uneasy. Why had her uncle invited her here? She had lived her whole life in a quiet village, and now she was in a giant, mysterious house with a man she barely knew. And what had he meant when he said, "Don't wander"? As Ellie sat there, she thought she heard a faint sound, like a whisper. It was so soft, she wasn't sure if it was real or her imagination. She stood and listened, holding her breath. The sound came again, drifting through the hallway outside her room. Curiosity got the better of her. Ellie opened the door and peeked out. The hallway was dark, lit only by a few candles. She couldn't see anyone, but the whispering sound was clearer now. It seemed to be coming from farther down the hall. Against her better judgment, Ellie stepped into the hallway. The wooden floor creaked softly under her bare feet as she walked toward the sound. It led her to the bottom of another staircase, this one smaller and steeper, leading up to what looked like the attic. "Don't wander," her uncle's voice echoed in her mind, but she couldn't turn back now. Something about the whispering called to her, pulling her forward. Carefully, she climbed the stairs, her hand brushing against the cool railing. At the top of the stairs, she found a small, dusty door. The whispering had stopped, but Ellie's heart was racing. She reached out and pushed the door open. The attic was dark, lit only by the moonlight coming through a small window. The air smelled like dust and old wood. In the middle of the room was a table, and on the table lay a book, its cover worn and cracked with age. Ellie stepped closer, her hands trembling as she picked up the book. It felt heavier than it looked, and the moment she opened it, she gasped. The pages were filled with strange symbols, drawings, and words she didn't understand. But on the inside cover, one sentence was written in large, clear letters: "The secrets of Ravenswood must never be spoken aloud." Part 2. The Whispering Walls. Ellie stared at the book in her hands, her heart thumping loudly in the silence of the attic. The words, "The secrets of Ravenswood must never be spoken aloud," seemed to leap off the page, filling her with both fear and curiosity. She turned another page, but the symbols and drawings made no sense to her. It wasn't just an old book, it was something more, something powerful. But why was it left here, forgotten in the attic? Suddenly, a faint creak behind her made her freeze. Ellie spun around, clutching the book tightly. The attic was empty, but for a moment, she thought she had seen a shadow move near the staircase. She listened closely, but all she could hear was her own breathing and the soft rustle of the wind outside. "This is silly," she muttered to herself. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Carefully, Ellie closed the book and placed it back on the table. She made a mental note to return later to examine it more closely. For now, the attic's dark corners and heavy silence felt too overwhelming. She hurried back down the narrow staircase, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. By the time she reached her room, the strange whispers she had followed seemed like a distant memory. She closed the door firmly behind her and leaned against it, her mind racing. What secrets could the book hold? And why had her uncle warned her not to wander? Did he know about the attic? About the book? Ellie barely had time to collect her thoughts before the sound of a bell echoed through the manor, signaling dinner. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since that morning, but the thought of facing her uncle again filled her with unease. Ellie found the dining room at the end of a long hallway. The table was massive, its dark wood polished to a shine, and the flickering light of a chandelier reflected off silver dishes. Her uncle sat at the head of the table, already eating, his sharp features even more pronounced in the low light. "Sit," he said without looking up. Ellie took a seat near the middle of the table, far from her uncle. A maid appeared silently, placing a bowl of soup in front of her. Ellie muttered a thank you and picked up her spoon, her hands trembling slightly. For a while, the only sound was the clinking of cutlery. Ellie glanced at her uncle, trying to read his expression, but his face was unreadable. Finally, she worked up the courage to speak. "Uncle Alaric," she began, her voice uncertain. "This house, it's so big. Have you lived here alone for long?" Her uncle paused, setting his fork down carefully. His eyes met hers, and for a moment Ellie thought she saw a flicker of something, sadness, anger, in his expression. "Ravenswood has been in our family for generations," he said slowly. "It is my responsibility to look after it. But it feels so empty," Ellie said, her words spilling out before she could stop them. "I mean, it's beautiful, but it's enough." His voice was calm but firm, cutting her off. "You've had a long journey, Eleanor. Finish your meal and rest. Tomorrow we'll talk." Ellie's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she nodded and focused on her soup. She could feel his eyes on her, and she couldn't help but wonder what he wasn't telling her. That night, Ellie lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was too quiet, and every small sound, the groan of the floorboards, the creak of the wind against the windows, set her on edge. She couldn't stop thinking about the attic, the book, and the strange sentence written inside it. What secrets could Ravenswood possibly hold? Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a faint sound reached her ears. It was the whisper again, soft, distant, and impossible to ignore. Ellie sat up, her heart pounding. She looked toward her door, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Still, the whisper continued, seeming to come from somewhere deeper in the house. Without thinking, Ellie slipped out of bed and grabbed her lantern. She hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the door. Uncle Alaric's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't wander." But curiosity burned brighter than caution. She stepped into the hallway, the cold floor sending a shiver up her spine. The whisper was faint but steady, guiding her down the hall and toward the grand staircase. She moved as quietly as she could, her lantern casting long shadows on the walls. The whisper led her to a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the end of a corridor. It was slightly ajar, and the faint light of her lantern revealed stone steps leading downward. "The cellar?" Ellie whispered to herself. She hesitated. Something about the darkness beyond the door felt wrong, like stepping into it would mean crossing a line she couldn't return from. But the whisper was louder now, as if urging her on. Taking a deep breath, Ellie stepped through the door and began descending the stairs. The air grew colder as Ellie moved deeper into the cellar. The walls were made of rough stone, and the faint smell of damp earth filled the air. Her lantern's light flickered, casting eerie shapes that danced on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, Ellie found herself in a large, open room. Old crates and barrels were stacked against the walls, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten decorations. But what caught Ellie's attention was a door at the far end of the room. It was smaller than the other doors in the manor, made of heavy wood and reinforced with iron. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, and a faint glow seemed to pulse from the carvings. Ellie's curiosity burned brighter than ever. She reached out to touch the door, but before her fingers could make contact, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening. Ellie held her breath, her hand hovering inches from the door. The glow from the symbols flickered, as if reacting to her presence. She could feel something on the other side of the door, something old, powerful, and waiting. "Eleanor," a voice said sharply from behind her. Ellie gasped and spun around, her lantern shaking in her hand. Uncle Alaric stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale and his eyes wide with anger. "What are you doing down here?" he demanded, his voice low but trembling with barely contained fury. "I told you not to wander." Ellie opened her mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Her uncle strode forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the door. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "This is not a game, Eleanor. There are things in this house that should never be touched." He led her back up the stairs, his grip firm but not cruel. Ellie didn't resist, but her mind raced with questions. What was behind the door? Why was her uncle so afraid of it? And why had the whispers led her there? Part 3, The Forbidden Door. Ellie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. "This is not a game. There are things in this house that should never be touched." But what did he mean? And why had the whispering led her to the cellar door with the strange carvings? She thought of the symbols, glowing faintly as if they were alive, and the heavy silence that had fallen just before her uncle appeared. The questions gnawed at her, making sleep impossible. As dawn broke, Ellie sat up and decided she couldn't ignore it. She needed answers. After breakfast, Ellie wandered through the house, keeping an ear out for her uncle. He had left the dining room quickly, muttering something about work in his study, and she knew better than to disturb him. In the kitchen, she found Catherine "Cat" Pemberton, the housekeeper's daughter. Cat was a few years younger than Ellie, with curly auburn hair and a mischievous smile. She had been the only person to greet Ellie warmly when she arrived at Ravenswood. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Cat said, smirking as she polished a silver tray. "What's wrong?" Ellie hesitated. Could she trust Cat? But something about her easy smile made Ellie feel safe. She leaned in and whispered, "Do you know anything about the door in the cellar?" Cat froze, her rag hovering over the tray. "The one with the carvings?" Ellie nodded. Cat glanced toward the kitchen door, making sure no one was nearby, then lowered her voice. "They say it's cursed. My mom says nobody should go near it, but, well, there's always stories, isn't there? Some say it's a tomb, others say it's a portal. Whatever it is, your uncle's terrified of it." Ellie's curiosity burned brighter. "A portal to where?" Cat shrugged, her eyes wide with excitement. "How should I know? I've never been down there. Mum would kill me. But you," she grinned. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Ellie nodded again. "I think there's something behind it, something powerful." Cat leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you want to find out?" That night, Ellie waited until the house was quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and Ellie slipped out of her room, a lantern in one hand, and her heart pounding in her chest. She met Cat at the top of the cellar stairs. The younger girl held a small satchel, the faint clink of its contents suggesting she had come prepared. "What's in the bag?" Ellie asked. "Candles, chalk, and salt," Cat whispered. "You know, just in case." Ellie didn't ask what "just in case" meant. Together, they crept down the stone steps, their lanterns casting flickering light on the walls. The cellar felt colder than before, and the air seemed heavier, pressing against Ellie's skin. When they reached the door, Ellie felt the same pull as before, a strange, unexplainable feeling that something behind the door was calling to her. The carvings on the wood glowed faintly in the lantern light, their shapes twisting as if they were alive. "What now?" Kat asked, her voice barely audible. Ellie hesitated, then reached out to touch the door. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the carvings flared with light. The room filled with a low humming sound, like distant voices murmuring in unison. Kat stepped back, clutching her bag. "Ellie, I don't think this is a good idea." Before Ellie could respond, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark passageway. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. Ellie and Kat exchanged a look. Ellie's heart was racing, but she couldn't turn back now. She stepped through the doorway, and Kat followed reluctantly, holding her lantern high. The passageway sloped downward, its walls carved from rough stone. Strange symbols, similar to those on the door, lined the walls, glowing faintly in the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the humming sound grew louder, resonating in Ellie's chest. At the end of the passage, they entered a circular chamber. The room was empty except for a stone pedestal in the center, upon which rested a large black mirror. Its surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting their lantern light like water. Surrounding the pedestal were faint markings on the floor, forming a strange, intricate pattern. "What is this place?" Kat whispered, her voice trembling. Ellie approached the mirror, her eyes fixed on its surface. She could see her own reflection, but it looked strange, distant, as if it wasn't really her. When she reached out to touch it, the humming stopped, and the room fell into complete silence. "Ellie, don't," Kat started, but it was too late. The moment Ellie's fingers touched the mirror, the surface rippled like water. Her reflection vanished, replaced by swirling darkness. Then slowly an image began to form. Ellie saw a figure standing in a forest, cloaked in shadows. The figure turned, and Ellie gasped. It was her. Not just a reflection, but her, standing in a forest she didn't recognize, holding the same black mirror. The other Ellie stared back at her, and for a moment, it felt like the two were connected, as if they were looking into each other's souls. "Ellie, step back!" Kat shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. The moment Ellie let go of the mirror, the image disappeared, and the humming returned, louder than before. The markings on the floor began to glow, and the air filled with a sharp, crackling energy. "We need to leave," Kat yelled. Ellie nodded, her heart pounding. They turned and ran back up the passageway, the humming growing louder and louder behind them. By the time they reached the cellar stairs, the sound had become deafening, like 1,000 voices crying out in unison. They burst into the hallway, slamming the cellar door shut behind them. The house was silent again, but the two girls stood there, panting and staring at each other. "What was that?" Kat whispered, clutching her bag tightly. "I don't know," Ellie said, her voice shaking, "but I think it was trying to show me something." Kat frowned. "Show you what?" Ellie didn't answer. She couldn't shake the image of herself in the forest, holding the mirror. What did it mean? And why had the whispers led her to the crypt? One thing was clear. Whatever secrets Ravenswood held, they were far more dangerous and far more personal than Ellie had ever imagined. Part 4, The Forest of Shadows. Ellie barely slept that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in the crypt over and over. The mirror's image haunted her, her own face, her own figure, standing in a forest she didn't recognize. The swirling darkness, the humming sound, and the glowing symbols, it all felt like a puzzle with pieces just out of reach. When dawn finally broke, Ellie rose quietly, determined to find answers. Kat had promised to meet her in the library, and though the events of the previous night had left them both shaken, Ellie knew she couldn't ignore what they'd discovered. The library was massive, its walls lined with shelves that stretched nearly to the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and ink. Kat was already there, perched on a ladder and pulling down books with titles like The Secrets of Binding Magic and Ancient Symbols of the Forgotten Isles. "Found anything yet?" Ellie asked, setting her lantern on a nearby table. Kat shook her head, flipping through the pages of a leather-bound tome. "Not much. A few mentions of enchanted mirrors, but nothing about what we saw." She climbed down, holding the book out to Ellie. "This one's weird, though. It talks about mirrors that act as doorways, ways to connect different places, or even different versions of yourself." Ellie frowned, taking the book. "Different versions?" Kat nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, like reflections. Some mirrors don't just show your face, they show another you, a you that might exist in a different time or place." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "But why would it show me, in that forest?" "I don't know," Kat said, pulling out another book. "But I think the symbols we saw are a clue. They're old, older than the manor maybe. If we can figure out what they mean, we might figure out what the mirror wants." Ellie sat down at the table, poring over the books Kat had found. The hours slipped by as they worked, flipping through pages filled with ancient spells, forgotten rituals, and strange glyphs. Finally, Ellie's eyes landed on a drawing that made her heart race. "This," she said, pointing to the page. The illustration showed a mirror surrounded by glowing symbols, almost identical to the ones they'd seen in the crypt. "It says the symbols are part of a spell called the Binding. It's meant to seal something dangerous." Kat leaned over her shoulder, reading aloud. "The Binding is used to trap shadows and keep them from crossing into the world of the living. Breaking the Binding can release what has been sealed." She looked at Ellie, her face pale. "You didn't break the Binding, did you?" "I don't think so," Ellie said quickly. "But the mirror, it reacted when I touched it. What if it's connected to something that's already been released?" Kat shuddered. "We need to tell your uncle. He probably knows more about this than he's letting on." Ellie hesitated. She wasn't sure she could trust Uncle Alaric. He had been furious when he found her near the crypt, but he hadn't explained why. Still, Kat was right. He clearly knew something, and they couldn't figure this out on their own. Ellie found her uncle in his study, a dimly lit room filled with stacks of papers, maps, and strange artifacts. He looked up sharply as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said, setting down his pen. "What is it?" Ellie took a deep breath, clutching the book in her hands. "I know about the crypt," she said, "and the mirror. I saw it." Her uncle's face darkened, and he rose slowly from his chair. "You shouldn't have gone down there." "Why?" Ellie demanded. "What is the mirror, and why is it showing me things?" Uncle Alaric sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, Ellie saw a flicker of vulnerability in his stern demeanor. "The mirror is a gateway," he said carefully. "It was created centuries ago to seal something powerful, something that should never be released." Ellie's heart raced. "What kind of something?" He hesitated, then said, "A shadow, not a person, but not a ghost either. It's a piece of darkness bound to our family for generations. It feeds on fear, on doubt, and it can only cross into this world if someone breaks the binding." Ellie felt a chill settle over her. "And the forest? The other me?" Her uncle's expression grew grim. "The shadow takes many forms. It uses reflections, dreams, and memories to confuse its victims. If it showed you something, it means it's trying to lure you in." Ellie stepped back, her mind racing. "So what do we do? How do we stop it?" Uncle Alaric shook his head. "We can't stop it. The binding is the only thing keeping it contained. All we can do is make sure it stays sealed." "But what if it's already loose?" Ellie pressed. "What if it's already in the house?" Her uncle's silence was answer enough. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Her uncle's warning echoed in her mind. The shadow uses reflections, dreams, and memories to confuse its victims. She thought of the mirror in the crypt and the strange image it had shown her. Was it really the shadow trying to lure her in? Or was it something else, something trying to guide her? Unable to stay in bed, Ellie lit her lantern and crept out of her room. The house was silent, but she felt the same pull she had felt before, the same whispering voice calling to her. This time, it led her not to the cellar, but to a small door at the back of the house, one she hadn't noticed before. She opened the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, and the forest loomed ahead, its trees swaying gently in the wind. Ellie hesitated, but the pull was stronger now, urging her forward. She wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders and stepped into the woods. The further she walked, the darker it became. The moonlight barely reached through the thick canopy of trees, and the air felt heavy as if the forest itself was alive. Ellie's lantern flickered, and she thought she saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision. Finally, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a tall black tree with twisted branches. Its bark was marked with the same glowing symbols she had seen in the crypt, and beneath the tree stood the mirror. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The mirror's surface shimmered, and slowly an image began to appear. It was her again, standing in the clearing, but this time the other Ellie held out her hand as if inviting her forward. "Don't," a voice whispered behind her. Ellie spun around and saw Kat, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Ellie, don't touch it," Kat begged. "It's trying to trap you." Ellie hesitated, torn between the pull of the mirror and Kat's warning. Her reflection in the mirror smiled faintly, and for a moment, Ellie felt as though she was staring into her own soul. Part 5, The Shadow's Lure. The clearing was silent, except for the faint rustling of the wind through the twisted branches of the black tree. Ellie's heart pounded as she stood between the glowing mirror and Kat's trembling voice behind her. "Ellie, please," Kat said again, stepping closer but keeping her distance from the tree and the mirror. "It's not safe." Ellie's reflection in the mirror tilted its head, a faint smile playing at its lips. Her twin in the glass seemed more alive than any reflection should be. It felt like the image was waiting for her to make a move. "It's showing me something," Ellie murmured, almost to herself. "What if it's a clue? What if it's a trap?" Kat shot back, her voice shaking. "Ellie, your uncle said this thing, this shadow, feeds on people's fears. It's already messing with you." Ellie hesitated, Kat's words ringing in her ears. But the pull from the mirror was undeniable. It wasn't just fear or curiosity driving her. It was something deeper, a feeling that the answers she needed were right there, just out of reach. She stepped closer to the mirror, her lantern casting flickering light across the swirling symbols etched into its surface. "Ellie!" Kat shouted, but it was too late. Ellie reached out and touched the mirror. The moment her fingers met the cool surface of the glass, the world shifted violently. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish, and for a dizzying moment, Ellie felt as though she were falling through darkness. When the spinning stopped, she opened her eyes and gasped. She was no longer in the forest clearing. The twisted black tree and the glowing mirror were gone, replaced by a strange shadowy landscape. The ground was covered in thick fog that clung to her feet like water. The air was cold and still, and the sky above was an endless void, neither day nor night. Shapes moved in the distance, dark, shifting forms that seemed to melt and reappear like smoke. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as one of the shapes turned toward her. It had no face, but its presence was heavy, as though it were watching her. "Ellie!" Kat's voice broke through the eerie silence, and Ellie turned to see her friend standing just a few feet away, clutching her bag tightly. Somehow, Kat had followed her into this strange world, though how she had crossed through the mirror, Ellie couldn't say. "You shouldn't have touched it," Kat said, her voice trembling. "This place, it's not real, or at least it's not ours." Ellie nodded, unable to speak. The shadows in the distance were moving closer, and the heavy air pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She turned in a slow circle, searching for a way out, but there was nothing but fog and darkness in every direction. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint glow in the distance, like the light of a lantern flickering in the dark. "This way," she said, grabbing Kat's arm and pulling her toward the light. The glowing light led them to another clearing, but this one was unlike the first. In the center stood a figure cloaked in shadow, holding a staff that pulsed with golden light. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but its presence was commanding, almost comforting. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice deep and echoing as though it came from all around them. "The shadow has already begun its work." Ellie stepped forward, still clutching her lantern. "What is this place? Why did the mirror bring us here?" The figure tilted its head as if studying her. "This is the space between," it said. "A reflection of your world, twisted by the shadow's influence. It feeds on fear and doubt, and it grows stronger with every moment you linger here." Ellie swallowed hard. "How do we stop it?" The figure was silent for a moment, then said, "The shadow is bound to the mirror, just as it is bound to your family. It cannot be destroyed, but it can be contained. The binding must be restored." Ellie frowned. "The binding? The symbols on the door?" The figure nodded. "They are ancient magic, designed to keep the shadow trapped. But the shadow is clever. It has lured you here because it knows the binding is weakening. If you do not act, it will break free." Ellie glanced at Kat, who looked as pale as a ghost. "How do we restore the binding?" The figure raised its staff, and the golden light flared brighter. "To seal the shadow, you must face it. It will test you, try to trick you, but you must remain strong. Only then can the mirror be sealed." Ellie's hands trembled, but she nodded. "I'll do it." The figure lowered its staff, and the light began to fade. "Follow the light," it said, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. "It will lead you to the shadow's heart. But be warned, once you face it, there is no turning back." Ellie and Kat followed the glowing path through the shadowy landscape. The air grew colder with every step, and the dark shapes in the fog seemed to press closer, their whispers growing louder. Ellie clutched her lantern tightly, her mind racing with fear and determination. Finally, they reached another clearing. In the center stood the black mirror, its surface rippling like water. The symbols around it glowed faintly, but they were cracked and broken, their light flickering like dying embers. As Ellie stepped closer, the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The fog thickened, and a shape began to emerge from the mirror's surface. It was dark and formless at first, but as it stepped forward, it began to take shape. Ellie gasped. The figure was her own face, her own eyes, but twisted and cruel. The shadow version of herself smiled, its teeth sharp and unnatural. "You think you can stop me?" the shadow hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You are nothing, just a scared little girl, lost in a world you don't understand." Ellie clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. "You don't scare me," she said, her voice steady. "I know who I am." The shadow laughed, a sound that echoed like shattering glass. "Do you? Let me show you." Before Ellie could react, the shadow lunged forward, and the world around her dissolved into darkness. Part 6, The Shadow's Test. Ellie's heart pounded as the world dissolved into darkness. She felt weightless, like she was floating in a void with nothing to hold on to. The only sound was her own breath, shallow and shaky, echoing in the emptiness. Then the darkness shifted. Shapes began to form. Faint, blurry outlines that slowly came into focus. Ellie found herself standing in her old bedroom, the one she hadn't seen since she left her village to come to Ravenswood Manor. Everything was exactly as she remembered. The worn quilt on her bed, the small bookshelf filled with her favorite stories, and the window that overlooked the village square. For a moment, Ellie felt a wave of comfort and nostalgia, but the feeling didn't last. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, and the room was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Ellie stepped toward the window, and her reflection in the glass made her freeze. It wasn't her. The figure in the window looked like Ellie, but its eyes were dark and hollow, and its expression was twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can defeat me," the shadow said, its voice cold and sharp. "You don't even know who you are." Ellie stepped back, her hands trembling. "You're not real," she said, trying to steady her voice. "You're just trying to scare me." The shadow tilted its head, its smile widening. "Am I, or am I the truth you've been running from?" Before Ellie could respond, the room around her began to shift again. The walls melted away, and she was standing in a different place, a forest, dark and silent, with twisted trees and a cold wind that bit at her skin. The ground beneath her feet was covered in ash, and the air smelled of smoke. "You failed them," the shadow's voice whispered, echoing through the trees. "You let them down. That's why you're here." Ellie's chest tightened as memories flooded her mind. Her parents' faces kind and loving, but always tired. The day she left the village, their worried expressions as they waved goodbye. She had promised to write, to visit, but she hadn't. She had been too caught up in her own world, too busy chasing her curiosity. "It's not true," Ellie said, shaking her head. "I didn't." The shadow appeared in front of her, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. "You abandoned them, just like you'll abandon everyone else. That's who you are, Ellie, a selfish, scared little girl." Ellie clenched her fists, tears burning in her eyes. "No, I'm not like that," the shadow laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Prove it." Ellie felt the weight of the shadow's words pressing down on her, but she forced herself to stand tall. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm not perfect, but I'm not what you say I am. I care about the people I love. I'm here because I want to protect them." The shadow hissed, its form flickering. "Lies. You don't even know what you're fighting for." "I do," Ellie said, stepping closer to the shadow. "I'm fighting for my family, for Ravenswood, for myself." As she spoke, a faint light began to glow in her chest. It started small, like the flicker of a candle, but it grew brighter with every word. The shadow recoiled, its form shrinking as the light spread. "You can't defeat me," the shadow spat, its voice growing weaker. "I am you." Ellie shook her head. "You're not me. You're just the part of me that's afraid, and I'm done letting you control me." With those words, the light in Ellie's chest flared, filling the forest with warmth and brilliance. The shadow let out a final piercing cry before dissolving into smoke. The forest faded, and Ellie found herself back in the clearing with the black mirror. Kat was standing a few feet away, her face pale but her eyes wide with relief. "You did it," Kat whispered. "The shadow, it's gone." Ellie nodded, her chest still glowing faintly with the light she had discovered within herself. She turned to the mirror, its surface now calm and clear. The glowing symbols around its frame had been restored, shining brightly in the darkness. Ellie stepped closer to the mirror, the warmth in her chest guiding her. She reached out and placed her hand on the glass. The symbols flared with light, and the humming sound returned, low and steady. The words of the guardian echoed in her mind. The binding must be restored. Ellie closed her eyes, focusing on the light within her. She imagined it flowing from her chest, through her arm, and into the mirror. The symbols around the frame grew brighter, their glow spreading to the ground and up into the sky. The air around her shimmered, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a final burst of light, the mirror let out a soft, melodic hum and went still. "It's done," Ellie whispered, stepping back. The mirror's surface was now dark and calm, its power sealed. Kat ran to her side, throwing her arms around Ellie. "I thought we were done for," she said, laughing shakily. "You scared me half to death." Ellie smiled, her body trembling with exhaustion. "I scared myself too." When Ellie and Kat returned to the manor, the air felt different. The house, which had always seemed cold and heavy, now felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Uncle Alaric was waiting for them in the entrance hall, his expression unreadable. "You did it," he said simply, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and pride. Ellie nodded. "The shadow is sealed, the binding is restored." Her uncle stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. You've done more than I ever could, Eleanor. Ravenswood is safe because of you. Ellie looked up at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. For the first time, she saw him not as the stern, distant figure she had met on her first day, but as someone who cared deeply for their family and the legacy of Ravenswood. As the days passed, Ellie began to feel at home in the manor. She spent her mornings exploring its many rooms and hallways, uncovering its secrets, and her evenings in the library with Kat, studying the magic that had protected their family for generations. Though the shadow was gone, Ellie knew her journey was just beginning. The mirror had shown her that she was stronger than she had ever believed, and she was determined to use that strength to protect the people she loved and the place she now called home. Ravenswood Manor, with all its mysteries and magic, had become more than just a house. It was a part of her, and she was ready to embrace it fully. As she stood on the manor's grand staircase one evening, looking out at the darkening sky, she saw a raven perched on the railing. Its golden eyes met hers, and for a moment it seemed to nod, as if acknowledging her victory. Ellie smiled. The echoes of Ravenswood were no longer something to fear. They were a part of her story, a story she was ready to continue.